Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, and we have an exciting event today. We have both my long-term friend and editor, Sam Tanenhaus, who is editor both of the New York Times Book Review and the Week in Review section for a number of years, and is also, appositely, the author of the standard book, a biography of Whittaker Chambers. Since some of you may know, this used to be the Nixon Center. Sam's book went a long way towards, perhaps rehabilitating is the wrong word, but restoring the centrality of Whittaker Chambers' importance, and that he was actually right, which was something that a lot of people, particularly among liberals, did not want to hear. So Sam's book, which I believe was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, was a very significant accomplishment. And today, he has written a extensive piece on the Bush dynasty, which he calls the perfect dynasty for an angrily populist age. And I thought that he could explicate that for us and explain why that's the case. And to juxtapose Sam, I invited another friend and long-term acquaintance, Henry Olsen, who I first met when he was vice president at the American Enterprise Institute. He is now a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, regular contributor to the National Review, and I think describes himself as a Reagan Republican, if that's a fair description. Yeah. So I will first have Sam kick it off with 10 to 15 minutes of comments, and then Henry will respond, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Everybody hear me? I tend to shout. I don't know if I need this. Yeah? Should I use this? Yeah, okay. And is it... Should I speak right into it like this? Is that better? I think you're louder when you shout. So I should shout. Okay, you know what? I'll just shout, and we'll hope that it gets picked up by this. First of all, thank you, Jacob, for the generous introduction. Whenever people introduce me, they remind me of the book prizes I haven't won. And boy, Chambers seems a long time ago. Reagan seems a long time ago. I want to thank Jacob for this event, also for encouraging me to write about the Bushes, who utterly mystify me. I pretend to have no insight into the Bush family and how they got where they are, why they're still there today. But there are a couple of things that occurred to me as I was reading in and around them. There are a number of people who were far more knowledgeable on this topic than I am. One of them is seated directly to my left. Another is the best historian of modern conservatism, in my view, my colleague Jeffrey Cabot-Service, who knows everything, which I do not pretend to do. But a couple of things did occur to me. One is that George H.W. Bush, now so esteemed by so many, including by our president, had one really bold, innovative stroke, I think, of a kind of insight or intuition when he left the East Coast for Texas, which seems, in retrospect, just another example of a guy trying to make it big, but he didn't really have to do that. One is reminded by his son, 43 as he calls himself, in his quite interesting book about his father, that these are blue bloods, and we really forget it. I had forgotten it or never knew it, just how establishment the Bush family really is. They go back a long ways. George W. points out that the Walker Cup is named for his family. The Yale connection, of course, is very deep, and Greenwich and Wall Street and all the rest. It's very much a kind of modern, late 19th century and early 20th century finance family, not so different from the Roosevelts a generation before. With the same, in Franklin as opposed to Theodore's case, the same kind of regular guy-ism. The Bushes are really, really good at that. But if anyone has read George W.'s memoir about his father, the patrician quality seeps through in these unexpected ways. And also, it's an interesting book for the subtext. I'm an English major, and I can't help thinking in those terms. One of the greatest discussions of a presidential memoir, pre-presidential memoir, I'm aware of, is Gary Wills's discussion of Nixon's 6 crises in Wills's great book, Nixon Agonistes. And what he does is to read against what Nixon is saying and to pull out all the kind of concealed or repressed passions and arguments in it. And two things, this happens also, you feel this in 41, George W. Bush's memoir about his father. And two themes really leap out. One is he really is trying very hard to make the case that he is his father's son. And that's a foreign policy argument he wants to make. That I chose the same advisors as Dad, and right down to Dick Cheney. There's kind of a climactic moment when he says that his father endorsed the selection of Cheney as his vice president. And the other is more interesting, is a kind of needling of his father that goes on in a very quiet way. George W. reminds you that his father was probably the last president who got there on inside connections. His patron was, of all people, Richard Nixon, who gave him a lot of really big jobs. And there's a powerful sentence in George W.'s memoir, which I quote in the piece, in which he says, he mentions the 4 big jobs his father had had after he was defeated twice for the Senate. But it's pretty tough to lose Senate races twice and then become president. And his real shot came when he thought he might be named vice president by Gerald Ford. And he really lobbied hard for it, which his son does not say. You can find that in Herbert Parmet's book, which is really good. The late Herbert Parmet wrote a biography of George H.W. Bush called, I think, Lone Star Yankee, which is a clever and instructive title. That what George Bush did was to combine those two supposedly warring wings of the Republican Party, unite them under himself, and he did it better than we realized. But at any rate, he had these 4 big jobs. He ran the RNC, Republican National Committee. He was briefly the head of CIA. He was ambassador to the UN. No one remembers it. All we remember is Moynihan as ambassador to the UN in roughly the same period. And he was a lead envoy to China. And George W. Bush says, my father was the only person to hold these 4 jobs and become president. And then he says, in fact, he's the only one to hold any of these jobs and become president. And to me, that is a sentence George H.W. Bush's strongest critic could write about him. That this is someone who got there through connections and essentially patronage. And that's why he really wanted the vice presidency, which he lost to Nelson Rockefeller. Paradoxically, through Watergate, although George H.W. Bush didn't do anything wrong in Watergate, but it essentially cost him that job. So reading all of this made me realize that the Bushes are a more consequential family than I'd realized. But I don't know, and I'm hoping Henry will jump in right now and tell us what that means for the newest Bush, or not the newest, but the most current. And I'll say a couple of things about him, about Jeb Bush. One is, should he be elected, that would be our 4th consecutive baby boomer president. I'm not sure that the country wants that at this moment. On the other hand, his almost certain opponent, Hillary Clinton, is also a baby boomer. One forgets, Obama belongs to the same generation as his 2 predecessors in sort of actuarial terms. He's a baby boomer as well. If you're born between 1946 and 64, you're a baby boomer. Those are the 2, the first Clinton, the second Bush, and now Obama are all members of the same generation. So are Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. Now, people don't go to the polls and necessarily look at actuarial tables, but they do respond to the kind of moral or generational atmosphere surrounding someone. I think one of the interesting aspects of the new faces we're seeing in the Republican Party is how comparatively young they are. The oldest of them, by quite a lot, of the aside from Jeb Bush, is Rand Paul. Ren was born in 1963. If you look at Cruz and Rubio, these are guys born in the 70s. Scott Walker was born in the 1970s. They were teenagers when Reagan was president, young teenagers in some cases. So I think that's a question about Jeb Bush. Also, and this is where Henry's already written about this, whether you can make the kind of appeal Jeb seems to want to do to independents and Democrats so early on in the process, I just don't know if that can work. So I turn it over to you, Henry.
Sure. Go ahead, Ed.
You want the? Oh, you got one.
Yeah. No. Now I have one. Let me know if I'm not coming through. I'll try and emulate Sam in both the volume of my voice and the use of the microphone. I've learned a lot about the Bushes reading your piece, Sam. And I liked that you brought out that Bush started as a movement conservative, Bush 41. In fact, one of the things, as I write a lot about Ronald Reagan and what he means for today's conservatives, I like to point out that the first thing that Ronald Reagan ever wrote, it was a review of the 1964, in political terms, was a review of the 1964 election in National Review. He's one of 4 people who was selected. One of the other 4 was George Herbert Walker Bush. Yeah. Jeb has some strong advantages precisely because of those qualities that Sam talked about. This Bush ambition and doggedness, which you talk about more in the piece than you just talked about. A sense, in the piece, Sam talks about loyalty as being the primary value of the Bushes. And I would say that loyalty, I'd amend that slightly and say that loyalty is the cement that makes ambition possible in politics. And that these are people who are traditionally, when they set on the goal, they get it. And I think that's kind of where Jeb is right now, in the sense that he's, like his father, like his brother, has set himself on the goal and are calling in his chits. But there's peculiar weaknesses that are focused on Jeb that I think make him a very non-traditional front runner that suggests much greater likelihood of stumbling both in the primary and in the general election. So I'd like to use my time to go into that a little more detail. First, Jeb has not run a race since 2002. Jeb has not run a competitive race since 1998. Even his father, when he ran for president in 1980, was more closely in line with his very competitive 1970 Senate race than Jeb is to his most recent foray into competitive politics. To me, that raises questions of the degree to which he has maintained personally a sense of connection, not just with his party, but with the public at large. There's a lot of times I've been listening to Jeb and getting the sense that this is, that the perfect article title for Jeb would be 2001 Bush Odyssey, because it's so pre-9/11. He's concerned with immigration, he's concerned with using government power to increase educational opportunity for minority students. This is his brother's agenda prior to 9/11. And I think one of the difficulties Jeb is going to have is, since he has this space where he is, I had my research assistant do a Google search. What has Jeb Bush said about Obamacare, about Iraq? What has he said about Dodd-Frank? What has he said about anything that anybody will want to talk about? And the answer is nothing. 13 years of virtually no serious analysis or public pronouncement on any of the issues that existed or came to fore subsequent to 9/11. How he navigates that is going to be extremely crucial, because the country is not the same that elected his father and that elected his brother. I don't think he realizes that. I could be wrong. As somebody who is a Republican who hopes for a Republican victory, I kind of hope he's right. I hope that all of our candidates get that. But early on, I don't think that he has gotten that. And I think you can see that precisely in the sort of things that he's been talking about that I think raise a lot of question marks. The Republican Party has not moved to the right by any measure of how you look at the voting base. That if you go back and you look at Republican Party primary electorates for the presidential nomination, They self-describe themselves ideologically between moderates or liberals and conservatives, and then divide them between, are you very conservative or somewhat conservative? Those shares have not significantly shifted over the last 20 years. Even in the height of Tea Party fervor, 2012, what you would call the movement conservative is about a third of the Republican Party. The establishment conservative is about a third to 40% of the Republican Party, and the rest are actually moderates and liberals who still come out in presidential years. But what has happened is that the movement conservative wing has become extremely distrustful of the non-movement conservative wing. And that's not something either of his brother or his father had to face in quite the same degree. In 1980, his father did not run as the heir to Nelson Rockefeller. John Anderson did that. John Anderson would have been unacceptable to the movement conservative of 1980. George Herbert Walker Bush, not so much. Today, that animosity extends farther downwards, and he seems dismissive of it. Unlike his brother, who learned from his father's "Read My Lips, No New Taxes" pledge and then renunciation of that pledge to make sure that nobody ever got to his right in a way that threatened his position with the movement conservative. Jeb seems to be adopting the approach that I don't need the movement conservatives to win the nomination. From a numerical standpoint, that's correct if he can get it to a two-person race relatively quickly. But from a positioning standpoint, it means that unlike his brother, unlike his father, when push comes to shove, he may not be in a position to either get movement conservative votes as the race narrows down, or be the sort of person who would not inspire a futile third-party candidacy. Immigration is a huge issue with the base. It is not an issue that resonates as much with the wider electorate as the movement conservative base would like to believe, but it is a huge issue with the movement conservative base. And the way Jeb has positioned himself and talked about it means that he has undying enmity among a large number of the base in a way that his brother and his father in their respective first races never really did. This is going to be a problem with him navigating the early races where movement conservatives are particularly powerful. The states that have high numbers of movement conservatives tend to vote early, which means he's likelier to lose those states or not do well, because it's unlikely that a movement conservative won't be in the race that early. That's a problem for him in the primary electorate. The second problem in the primary electorate is Chris Christie. And that seems a little odd to say right now, but hear me out on this. The traditional way for a Republican establishment person to win the nomination has been to do very well among the establishment conservatives and then wait for an unacceptable alternative to emerge. You know, McCain in 2000 was running as a moderate, so that meant that when the movement conservatives dropped out, they flocked to George Herbert Walker or George W. Bush. You know, we forget that in 1980 in Iowa, George W. Bush won, but if you look at the exit polls, 37% of the movement conservative evangelicals voted for either Gary Bauer or Alan Keyes. Two people nobody thinks are even remotely qualified. Those voters are not going to vote for Jeb Bush in the early stages of the race. So then why do I talk about Chris Christie? It's because he is running well among moderates. He's positioning himself much more to be the sort of Republican who can win a general election than the Republican who can win the movement conservative. And he's positioning himself much more to be kind of the McCain of this race than any other candidate. And that means that there is the strong possibility that Christie, who already is running well in New Hampshire, can build upon that. And then you have the possibility that Jeb Bush gets flanked, gets faced not with a two-person race where the person comes out as a religious conservative unacceptable to the Republican left or a Republican moderate unacceptable to the right, but he comes out with a three-person race. He can't win a three-person race. He'll continually lose primaries if it's a three-person race because the southern states will go to the people on his right, the northern states will go to somebody on his left, and he'll be left after 25 states having won only 4 or 5 of them.
And who might those three be, do you think?
There will be somebody who is a movement conservative candidate. Traditionally, it's been somebody who's been a religious conservative and consequently unelectable. But this time it may not be. It may be somebody who is a Scott Walker, who's positioning himself more to be somebody from the right who reaches to the center than somebody from the center who reaches to the right. It may be somebody like a Ben Carson, who's unelectable in his own reasons, but he doesn't have that religious imagery that really alienates the Republican moderates. But because of the way it's set up, in 2000, all of the movement with conservative candidates dropped out who were serious dropped out after New Hampshire. 2 races, George Bush is the most conservative candidate standing. That's not going to be the case this time. There's no reason for a movement conservative strong candidate to drop out until at least the Texas primary and probably the early southern states, which means that unlike the only reason George W. Bush became president is because there was nobody to his right in South Carolina, which meant that he could combine a huge majority among the movement conservative, a small majority among the establishment conservative to offset the huge numbers of moderates who are voting for McCain. Jeb Bush will not have that. He will not go into South Carolina with nobody on his right. He will not go into the southern states that vote next that have nobody on his right. So if he has not knocked out Chris Christie by that point, he has no votes on the left to draw from. He'll be much more like Mitt Romney in 2008, who ran as the secular movement conservative and establishment type, who got flanked by McCain on his left, Huckabee on his right, and he did not win those states, and he had to drop out, even though he had the most money and the most establishment connections. So that would be my concern about Jeb's electability, is he hasn't run a race in a long time. He's not positioned the way his father or his brother was. He's alienated in the right in a way that neither of them had at that stage in their first race. And the primary dynamics are not going to mean a 2-person race after a very short number of time. But the general election, I think he's very poorly positioned for as well. He seems to be banking on the view that the problem with the Republican Party is a problem with Hispanic voters. And so consequently, because of his views on immigration and his time in Florida, is that he can bring together Hispanics and that can put together a presidential majority. If we had a nationwide popular vote, that might be the right way to go. But we don't. We have an electoral college. And if you look at the electoral college, absent some sort, if you look at the electoral college, Romney got 206 electoral votes. If you win all of the Romney states and you win all the states in which Hispanic voters are a significant percentage, you do not get to 270. They're highly concentrated in Democratic states or in only 3 swing states. In fact, in Nevada and Colorado, if you increased, according to the state exit polls, if Jeb Bush did as well as his brother did in Colorado and Nevada, and did as well as his brother, as Romney did among the white vote, he would still lose Colorado and Nevada, because George W. Bush's national Hispanic vote total was disproportionately felt in states that border Mexico: California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. It did not extend farther north than that, according to the state level exit polls. And then you look at where there's one voting bloc that does control enough or sway enough electoral college votes to put him over the top, and that's the Midwest, where the Midwest is the one part of the country that has not seen a significant influx of either Hispanics, Asians, or liberal college graduates. I mean, think about it. How many college graduates who you think are the sort of person who is interested in the creative classes, as Richard Florida says, sits down and says, yeah, let's see, Austin, Boston, New York, or Milwaukee. And you can see it in the voting statistics that all of these suburban counties that attract these people are 15 to 25 points less Republican today than they were when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. Milwaukee suburbs are more Republican. The Cincinnati suburbs are more Republican. The Cleveland suburbs are just as Republican. It's a different sort of person. The rising American electorate has not risen to the Midwest. And you take a look at where Republican candidates tended to do extremely well compared to Romney in 2014. It's not in Colorado, where Cory Gardner barely eked out a victory. It's not in Virginia, where an underfunded Ed Gillespie still wasn't able to pull it out. It's in the Midwest, where Joni Ernst massively outpulled Mitt Romney. Scott Walker did, Rick Snyder did. That's the Republican opportunity. And the person there does not want to hear recycled Republican economics. I'll be very interested to see how Jeb Bush positions himself on things like taxes and entitlement reform. I've written about this, that his early indications are to go along with the establishment, which is say that what we need to do is cut entitlements and cut regulation and cut taxes at the top. And that's exactly the wrong message to send to the Midwest. It reinforces all of the old stereotypes about Republicans not caring about people like me. And people like me in the Midwest are people without a college degree who face difficult job prospects to get a job that pays much more than $10 an hour, and would like something to change so that they don't have to live lives of dependency or live lives of uncertainty. If Jeb Bush thinks that the problem with the 2012 campaign was that Mitt Romney wasn't nice enough and he was interested in self-deportation and consequently alienated the Hispanic vote, he will not be the populist either of his parents were, or his father or his brothers were. His father, in 1988, this patrician cast himself into the defender of middle-class blue-collar values. And George Herbert Walker Bush is the last candidate to do really well in the northern suburbs in a presidential campaign and throughout the working class in the Midwest. Last Republican to carry Pennsylvania, last Republican to carry Michigan, lost Wisconsin, I think because of the agricultural price problems there. His brother ran, as we know, populist campaigns, but they're very southern tuned. In his campaigns is when we start to see the hyper concentration of Republican votes among evangelicals and Southerners, and you start to see that, if you compare it, Bush 43 gains well in the South, but not in the North. And you have this close electorate where he did not move, he only moved part of the Reagan Democratic coalition. And then you've got a Jeb Bush who seems to be uninterested in moving either part of the old Reagan coalition. I have very strong doubts about, and this is very early and he could do a lot to disprove, but I have very strong doubts about his electability in the general election, even should he proceed through to the primary election. I would not surprise me if at the end of this we're thinking him less as the third president of a family, the first time with three people from the same family managed to make it, but more like the Teddy Kennedy or the Jimmy Roosevelt of these dynasties, the guy who had the connections but couldn't put it all together.
Wow. On that note, I'm going to
That was great, I have to say.
the formal presentation. I'm going to start it with one very simple question, and then I'll turn to all of you. Given this annihilation, this preemptive annihilation of Jeb's chances before he's even officially declared, I want to know from each of you, which is the Republican candidate that would have the best chance of defeating Hillary Clinton if she manages to weather all of her own scandals and achieve the Democratic nomination?
You go first, Henry. You know this stuff better than I do.
A lot of it depends on I know the two people I think are positioned to possibly do it are Scott Walker and Marco Rubio. Right. I think either combination of a Walker-Rubio ticket could do very well. But the key is, do they get that the problem with 2012 was the message and not the man? They haven't said enough specifics yet to really show that that they understand that the problem is that Republicans had fallen back into the pre-Reaganite, modern version of the pre-Reaganite characterization of we care about the creative class, but we don't. We care about the people in the business and the professions, but we don't care as much about the workers because, after all, we're the ones who create value.
Except Rubio does have, whatever you think of the policies, he's the one who seems to be the most ambitious.
That's right. He is the one who's the most ambitious, and part of what I want to see from Rubio, and the Republicans who are beginning to get this still talk in terms of poverty. They still talk in terms of I want to uplift, I care about the 5 words from the exit poll that's galvanizing the Republican Party. Well, let me quickly tell the story, and then I'll get out of this. Is that if you take a look at the exit poll they asked people, which of 4 qualities do you most want in a leader? 74% of the voters picked one of 3 qualities, and Mitt Romney won them by between 9 and 23 points. He loses because 22% select the fourth quality, and that is cares about people like me. And he loses that by 63 points. Okay. Republicans usually lose that issue, but they don't lose it as large, and it's not as large of the voting base. So what the Republican Party has done is kind of say, oh, we have a compassion problem. But they lopped off the last, too many people have lopped off the last two words. They say cares about people. And they've lopped off the words like me. And you see a lot of people in the Republican Party saying, I care about the poor. And I think, okay, my Midwestern voter is not a poor person. My Midwestern voter is somebody who works with their hands. His wife, if he's married, works probably either as a medical secretary, the person who you see when you go into a doctor's office. And I think, if I'm listening to this, what is there about me?
Sam, you're not off the hook. What's your reason?
Actually, I agree with a lot of that. And one of the points Henry raised that's of real interest to me, too, I just wrote a little something about it, is the resurgence of Midwestern Republicanism, which is a fascinating phenomenon. It's a very rich one in our history, and sorry, but I just tend to be more interested in what happened 60 years ago than what's happening now. But a couple of things I would point to is it's interesting if you are an alumnus or refugee or exile of the mainstream media, as I now am, having left the New York Times, is how few, say, of the paper's columnists understand that when governors like Rick Snyder, and John Kasich and Scott Walker actually put pressure on, say, state pensions going to public sector unions, they don't have a problem with a lot of their base when they do that. And this is what you're talking about. And just a couple of other things I'll toss out about that. I think Henry's diagnosis here is quite brilliant. Is the Midwest is a lot bigger than we think it is. It's 12 states. 10 of them have Republican governors. It's by my sort of back of the envelope calculation, there's 62 million people living there. It's a sizable part of the population. I think this is actually good news for the Republican Party that it's not about Dixie anymore. It's not really about the South. It's bad news for Jeb Bush. I think it's good news for the party and good news for America. Jeff Cavasservis will know this very well. Robert Taft and Bob La Follette were friends. Now, they were friends partly because they were both anti-interventionists. And that brings up the great question I hope will be discussed here. Free associating here. I thought Jacob's recent column was brilliant. That this could be a moment, I'm going to be writing about this too, where the Republican Party and conservative thinkers and voters and just normal people can actually participate in a great redefining debate within the party on foreign policy. Mr. Burton knows all about this through Rand Paul and others who were actually raising questions about foreign policy that date back to the great origins of the Republican Party. There's Dan McCarthy down there. He knows very well where Bob Taft and others were on foreign policy a long time ago, and that this is actually resurfacing on within the Republican Party and in our politics in general. To me, is one of the most important things that's happened in politics in a really long time. And when Henry points out, and I hadn't thought of it, that Jeb Bush's clock stops before 9/11, that's a remarkable fact when you consider who was president during 9/11. There's a kind of nostalgia in all of this, but it's the wrong nostalgia. I do think that there's a growing strength in the Republican Party that's coming from a different place now, and it's one that Hillary Clinton actually can be fairly effective with. She was certainly when she ran against Obama in 2008. She was very strong with the white working class and the white middle class. And if that's a problem, and Henry has written this, if that's a problem for Jeb Bush, then he's finished. So the question then becomes whether, I agree, it's Walker and Rubio. Rubio's problem is he also did the immigration, made that argument very early on. He was one of the 8 senators. He plunged in the ratings. We commissioned a poll early on at the Times, and I was writing about Rand Paul. We did a survey at that point. When I first started working on Rand Paul, I did a long piece on him with a colleague. We started in the spring of 2013, and at that point, Rand was leading almost everybody who called himself or herself a Republican. A lot of it had to do with foreign policy and questioning a really strongly interventionist foreign policy. And Rubio looked pretty good in those polls, and then he sank after immigration. I don't know if he's ever come back, although he's smart and personable. If anybody has met him, he's extremely ingratiating. I'll tell you one little story about him, and then I'll stop, and I hope we can get to questions right away. But it's just my one personal experience with him. I did a story in the Sunday Times magazine on reform conservatives, reformicons as they're being called. And I heard from a colleague that Senator Rubio was interested in being interviewed for the story, which you don't often get when you're writing for a big newspaper. So I came to Washington to interview him. We spoke once in person, once on the phone. And before I met the senator, I met his communications director. And I said to him, and when you do this kind of story, as some people in the room will know very well, you actually explain to everybody what you're doing. There are no surprises. You're interviewing people who have public reputations and careers, and they don't want to be blindsided. And so the idea was that I was going to write a story about a new wave of conservative intellectuals who were identified with the Republican Party, but looking at different policies and programs. And so when I met with Senator Rubio's communications director, I asked him if Rubio was following the policy debates and if he read magazines like Jacob's or Dan McCarthy's Great American Conservative or Yuval Levin's National Affairs. And Alex Conan, I think his name was, said, "You'll have to ask Marco." And that really knocked me out. That he actually said you'll have to talk to the politician himself to find out what he reads and what he's interested in. It wasn't somebody else putting the words in his mouth. It made a huge impression on me. So ever since then, I've liked him.
All right, let's field any questions or brickbats from the audience. Larry Corp.
We hear a lot, I don't know if it's a myth, I haven't had a chance to read your article, but that the Bush family wanted Jeb to run for president first. Is that correct, and why did they do it?
Well, what happened was he seemed to be more politically serious, but of course he lost the first campaign in Florida, and his older brother won. But one of the points that comes through in various books, including Robert Draper's book about the second President Bush, is he was involved in politics really early. Both sons were involved in the father's campaigns at a very early age. It was the sons who negotiated with Lee Atwater to figure out how to run that campaign in '88. I think the idea was they thought Jeb was more serious-minded early on, but he was always the younger brother by quite a number of years, would always defer to the older one. He just seemed to be on a better track. Once George W. had that surprise win, I think it became pretty clear that he was the one who would go forward. Is that right, Henry?
Yeah, that's my understanding. And you have to also remember that W. underwent his conversion to evangelical Christianity between the '88 and the '94 races, and that made him grow up in a way that was not evident early on. And in a sense, the victories were indications of his maturation as opposed to causations of it.
Wayne, Mary.
Hi. Thank you. Mr. Tanenhaus, I must dispute the notion that Barack Obama, born in 1964, is a baby boomer.
Wait, he's born in 61.
61.
Yeah.
But in any case, anybody who didn't go through the 60s as an adolescent is not part of my generation.
I was born 2 months after him, and I would like to embrace that.
Yeah. Because the culture wars of the 60s defined my generation in ways that, for the most part, I regret, but nonetheless. But Mr. Olsen, you have given us a very hard-hitting analysis of the vulnerabilities of Jeb Bush in a general election. I must ask you to give us the same assessment for Hillary Clinton.
Okay. The Democratic coalition is much more stable than the Republican coalition in the general election. I mean, for Hillary, traditionally in the primaries, the Democrats broke into, in the post-Watergate era, broke into three groups, what Ron Braunstein calls the wine set, the progressive, educated, more liberal group, the beer set, the working class group, and then he never really focused on it, but those African Americans who were a distinct group. So that when an African American candidate ran, like Jesse Jackson, they would vote for the African American candidate, but in between two white candidates, they always sided with the beer set. What Barack Obama did was divorce the black group from their alliance with the beer set and added it to the wine set. That's, if you take a look at where the coalition came from, he is Bill Bradley with soul. And that's what made all the difference. It allowed him to win the South rather than lose the South. It allowed him to win the big cities with large African American populations rather than lose them. So for Hillary Clinton, it's quite obvious her opposition will continue to come from the wine set. She needs to reunite the African American constituency with the beer set. And now there is in some states, there is a fourth group, Hispanics, who are extremely important in Democratic primaries in California, in Texas, and she carried those very heavily. So if she runs, I don't see a whole lot of vulnerability in the primary from her unless she's completely incapable of running a national campaign and she makes a series of gaffes that are so obvious that we would clearly recognize that she's out of it. In the general election, what she needs to do is hold on to the Obama coalition's support among white working class in the Midwest. She will, of course, if it's Jeb Bush, need to repel his attempts to come at the Hispanic community. But all the polls indicate that Hispanics are not Republicans who are turned off by immigration. Every poll suggests that let me give you one poll. Public Religion Research Institute asks, which approach do you think will better grow the economy? Raising taxes and more spending on infrastructure and education, or cutting taxes and cutting programs and letting the private sector grow? Hispanics agree with the more liberal policy about 2 to 1. 31% agree with the Jeb Bush policy. So I don't think she would have too much trouble, honestly, in repelling Jeb Bush's, unless Jeb runs a different type of campaign than I think he's going to run. The battle is going to be, can she retain the support of white working class voters who voted for Obama or stayed home in 2008, but voted for Scott Walker twice? I think she can, but she's going to have to play a deft role between I'm enough of Obama to keep her Democratic viability on board, but I'm not Obama in a way so that they don't immediately equate her as a third term. I don't think it's going to be as hard for her to do that on issues like taxation and foreign policy. I also think that if the Republicans do what I expect they're going to do, which is run on a slightly modified version of the Romney platform, that she will successfully wage what the Republicans will call class warfare and keep enough of those voters home. Again, either not voting, because Republicans need a large turnout among them in the Midwest, and keeping the Republican margins down in order to win. Kevin Phillips, in his book, The Emerging Republican Majority of 1968, talked about the emerging moderate conservative majority. He was always clear that it was not a Bill Buckley fantasy conservative majority. It was a moderate conservative majority. He said that basically what happened was in the New Deal, the Democrats supported programs that benefited the many and taxed the few. And in the Great Society, too many of the things that were being done, in fact, put burdens on the majority and benefited the few. The Republican fuel the entrepreneur strategy, coupled with entitlement cuts, is easily demagoguable, no matter how sound it is in economics, as putting the burden on the many to benefit the few. What Scott Walker does in Wisconsin, by focusing on public employees unions, is to turn the equation on its head. The problem is the few, the public employees unions, and the virtuous are the many. If the Republicans can, Hillary Clinton will get that if the Republicans give her an opening. If the Republicans get it, then I think it'll be game on in the Midwest. But I would think if she actually wants to run for president, she doesn't have a lot of gaffes. I think she's a very strong candidate.
Ambassador Burt.
You both agreed, I think you both agreed, that the most credible competitors to Bush for the Republican nomination are Scott Walker and Marco Rubio. But then, Sam, you went on to talk about, if I understood you correctly, the impact that Rand Paul has had, at least in reflecting and maybe driving a new direction in Republican foreign policy thinking. But why is Rand Paul, reading the tea leaves here, badly positioned to be a true competitor for the nomination?
Okay. I'll have to lay a little groundwork. I wrote a piece for Jacob a year ago entitled "The Four Faces of the Republican Party."
Great piece.
Oh, thank you. Glad you read it. My argument is twofold. One is that there are really four factions that compete for dominance in the Republican Party. And in the early stages, what the candidates do is implicitly fight to become the favorite of one of those factions. And then as candidates emerge, other candidates start to drop out, and then it creates kind of like a game theory where the factions who no longer have a champion in the race say, well, who do I hate less? Rand Paul's problem is that Rand Paul is positioned to do well, like his father, among a very small segment of libertarian Republicans who are very vocal but have very few adherents in party primaries or caucuses, and non-traditional Republicans who describe themselves as moderate or liberal and are not likely to vote for the Republican nominee. That's where his father got his strength from, is that odd circle coalition, and all the polls show that, to the extent you can discern it, Rand Paul is appealing to the same group of people. That's why the civil liberties and the foreign policy set is crucial to his campaign, because that's what motivates the moderate, non-traditional Republican who would not otherwise vote for a Republican to come into his camp. He's poorly positioned because he has no natural base of support among any of those four factions. He's not naturally supportive. He's not naturally the establishment choice. He's not naturally the religious conservative choice. He could be the choice among non-libertarian fiscal conservatives, but people like Walker and Cruz are competitive with him there. And he's not the choice among moderate and traditional Republicans. In New Hampshire, you could see it, where he and Huntsman split the moderate vote, and basically the traditional moderates voted for Huntsman and the new people voted for Ron Paul. He could have a chance if, by the weirdness of how things, it's entirely possible that Rand Paul finishes first or second in Iowa, because 20 to 25% will get you there. It's entirely possible that the choice of a religious conservative like a Mike Huckabee finishes first or second there. You then go to New Hampshire, which is a moderate state. Almost 50% of the Republicans are moderate or liberals in the New Hampshire primary. And Paul's going to do very well there. It's entirely possible, if Christie's still alive, that you've got Rand Paul finishing first or second, Christie finishes first or second, and Jeb Bush finishing third. Then the question is, well, who does Rand Paul face up against? If he faces up against a religious conservative, well, the establishment Republicans will just throw up their hands, but they have to choose. Who would you rather have? Would you rather have Mike Huckabee or Rand? I've asked establishment Republicans this. Would you rather, if you had to choose between Rand Paul and Rick Santorum, who would you rather choose? And I make sure not to do it on tall buildings and around windows. But they will choose, and Rand Paul might win that.
Well,
it's unlikely he will do so, and that's why. But in order to talk to the general electorate, the general election, the general electorate is not as interventionist as the Republican base is. Second, virtually everybody in this room's primary foreign policy prism is the Cold War. If you're 30 and under, your primary prism is Iraq. Our primary prism is, how did we deal with the threat posed by the Soviet Union? How did we interpret it? Their primary prism is, in the world of a given given one power superpower, do we exercise our power justly and under what circumstances? That prism favors less intervention because of the circumstances of the Iraq. And that is the constituency that Rand Paul can be driving the debate on.
Right. Back when we did our early poll and he was doing so well, that was why. And if you remember, when Rand was first starting to take off, looked like a really serious contender, it looked as if he had Iowa, and that was before there was a shakeup in the state party. Then New Hampshire, his father had done very well, and the question was, could he win South Carolina? And Rand was spending a lot of time in South Carolina. He's friends with Jim DeMint. He has other contacts down there, because South Carolina was always a Waterloo for his father. And nowadays, I would raise a couple of other questions about Rand Paul. One has to do with his staff. I'm not sure how strong the staff is. Remember that small plagiarism, controversy? That was really a staffing issue. Rand Paul is not copying Wikipedia items into speeches. Somebody who works for him is doing that. And whether he acted well and moved up a category there is unclear to me. Rubio's staff is really quite good, I'm told, comparatively. As far as Hillary goes, I would mention a few things. One is she's an atrocious candidate. We saw this. She went out in 2008 as just as much the presumptive winner as she is this time around, and she was finished by the time the Iowa caucus ended. And the reason for that is telling. She did Iowa completely wrong. And do you know why she did Iowa wrong? Because her husband never ran there. And I think at this point, oh great, oh wow, some of that. Thank you. If she has, I was told by a reporter, a colleague at the Times, that Hillary almost never spent a single night in Iowa. She got in the luxury jet and flew back to New York and stayed in an expensive hotel. Now, if she does better than that now, one assumes she will, and that she has a better sense of how to comport herself in a primary, she has a chance. She's running now as Reagan did in 1980 without Reagan's skills, as the presumptive nominee without the political skills. She made her first presentation in Iowa after all that time at the Harkin event, and she was terrible. Could she get better at that? I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what foreign policy experts in this room think of this latest controversy about her using private email. I am not a foreign policy expert by any means, but I've written a lot of history. And when you write Cold War history, and when you do that, you rely on a set of documents called FRUS, Foreign Relations of the United States, and they are like biblical, right? They are cherished, sacred texts to us. And the idea that a Secretary of State is actually conducting foreign policy in a way that excludes material from getting in them, I have a problem with. And I think the other thing that hurts Hillary is her ideal running mate is the one person she can't choose, Elizabeth Warren. She can't do her. And that's the one who gets the working class and also the wine drinkers. That's your classic liberal, and she's the one person she can't put on her ticket, because even in this day and age, you can't have two women on one presidential ticket. That said, she does, as Henry, I think, is indicating, she does as well as Barack Obama, or better, with almost all the key constituencies. So the numbers seem to work to her advantage now, if there aren't questions of personality and character and all the rest, which is not to impugn her character at all, just her personality as a candidate. So I think that actually is a little bit of a problem for her. And we all know it's really hard for one party to win the third election. It's happened twice in modern times. It happened in the Roosevelt years. It happened again with Reagan, followed by the first George Bush. But it's pretty hard to do. So it's actually not as easy a campaign for her as some seem to think, but she does have the advantages, doesn't she?
I think so.
Well, we have a lot more questions. Ambassador?
Well, I don't need the mic. Okay. You said that the prism of today's voters' generation is Iraq.
Well, people
and
30 and under, yeah.
I just wondered if Russia and its aggression and redefined role in the world won't happen to be a new phenomena for defining a candidate in international politics.
I mean, people who are under 30 are not a majority of the electorate. So from a purely electoral standpoint, doesn't mean that any candidate needs to cater to their viewpoint. It's just, when we think of Russia, it's impossible to think of Putin without thinking about what preceded him, for people our age, because that's simply, we know all of that. Anyone under 30 has only heard about it through history books. The more aggressive he is, and the more unjust he appears, I think the more likelihood that a latent desire to defend freedom comes out. I do not think that the millennial generation is non-interventionist or isolationist, but I do think that what they have experienced is unilateral, in hindsight, semi-justified exertions of American power, and they would prefer not to see that again. And that's where Rand Paul's strength comes from. But would they be willing to support freedom against a clearly dangerous aggressor? I think that's still a uniform consensus, which is one reason why I think Putin is very cagey about how he pushes it, which is to say on and off, forward, not forward, precisely to avoid stoking the widespread fear that the bear is back.
Jeff, can I have a service?
I want to say, first of all, that I got my start in political history thanks to Sam, because I was his research assistant longer ago, I think, than either of us would like to recall. So I'll to all you, Sam. Lots of things to say here, lots of interesting points offered. I've read enough transcripts of forums like this a year and a half in advance of past elections to know that predictions are ridiculous. There's always someone there going, well, you know, this could actually be Harold Stassen's year. Having said that, you know, I'll go ahead with some of my own predictions. I think, first of all, forget about Scott Walker. Scott Walker's appeal to moderates is zero. And I think we've seen that in the last few weeks with the comments that have actually suddenly shocked people who thought they might have liked Scott Walker. And that's because his rise has a lot to do with the peculiarities of Milwaukee and the late migration of African Americans to that city. And a lot of people have actually studied this. He is not the Richard Nixon of this election. He is the George Wallace of this election. And you can see that if you listen to the radio, the talk radio that plays in Wisconsin, which is like a throwback to really racialized and ugly talk radio of the past. He's a non-starter. I actually do think that Jeb has a lot better chance, maybe, than people think. And that's for a couple of different reasons. Number one, there's actually, I think, a fair amount of nostalgia for the W presidency at this point. I spent a lot of time in eastern Tennessee. I see the bumper stickers. I miss W. I grew up in Florida. I knew what his Jeb appeal was to the conservatives there. And to something that Sam and I have talked about, you know, George W. came out of Phillips Academy and was, you know, he screwed around and was accepted by Yale. Jeb did the same amount of screwing around and was not accepted by Yale because he was at that point when things were changing in the generation. And he's carried that kind of class resentment with him, which has been very effective for him. And the great thing about the Bush is that they are kind of hybrids. Yes, they're blue bloods, but they have none of the sense of noblesse oblige and real paternalism and social responsibility that hamstrung people like Prescott Bush and kept him from becoming president. They definitely are in touch with the resentments of the country, and they channel them very effectively. And the other thing, though, is that, you know, they are not just completely on either the right or the establishment, if you want to put it that way. They are compassionate conservatives, which again is a hybrid form of conservative and a really effective one, and the only one that Republicans can actually win the presidency with, in my opinion. And it's not that they necessarily are going to go like George Romney did into the inner city and commune with the people there. They're about the people you're talking about in the Midwest. You know, the people who feel like they need a hand up of some kind, and yet they're really resentful of the government at the same time. The people who really resent those people who are on all those forms of government assistance, and yet they're on disability. And their relatives are on disability. And I think that Jeb can actually play that terrain more effectively than a lot of people at this point are giving him credit for.
Yeah, a couple of things I would add to that is the Bushes, for all their difficulties, are the last Republican presidents who were able to bring the factions together. That's why they are the last Republican presidents. They're both named Bush. I think that really is true. The hybrid is fascinating with George H.W. Bush, and that's why I started with that. He was actually ahead of his time. In the piece, I call him a kind of gyroscope, Republican gyroscope, who is sort of just like born to seek out what the right position is. You know, it's almost like a carpenter's level. He's really good at it. And we didn't see that because he was up against Ronald Reagan, who had assets he could never match. But actually, George H.W. Bush won the closest thing to the last landslide we've had. He won hugely in 1988. And we forget that. He won over 400 electoral votes. No president since has done that. they are really good at all of that, and they are. The one reason, as you know, Jacob said, introducing all of this, that I suggest in the piece that they're a dynasty that can actually work in a populist era, is they do not seem like aristocrats. Every time they stumble, every time they turn marble mouths and can't answer a question well, misspeak. Jeb does it now. His brother did it. His father, who was Phi Beta Kappa at Yale and graduated in 2.5 years, insisted he did not know what the word patrician meant. Right? Somehow they pull it off, and there's something weirdly authentic about them. And I think it's true. My question for you, Jeff, would be, and I know Henry has a lot to say about this too, is let's say all of everything you say about Jeb Bush is true, and everything you say about Scott Walker is true. Still, how does Jeb get through a series of primaries when some of the issues are things like Common Core and immigration, where there's so much animosity and so much distrust of him from a quite impassioned Republican base? How does he do that?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is there's so many different kinds of conservatism out there, none of which have dominance in any of these early states, that the fringe will knock each other out. And it's a question of who's going to be left standing. And that's going to be people with the most money, which is not Christie, and it is going to be Jeb.
Yeah. Henry, any comment?
I think you've made a good case for what Jeb could do. Being a Republican, would phrase some of the things you've talked about a little differently, but we don't get into that debate right now. I remain unconvinced that Jeb understands the working class in a way his brother seemed to innately do, and in a way that Lee Atwater trained his father to do. But I could be wrong. I think that when you're thinking about the Republican nomination, the thing you have to remember is how much things like ordering of primaries and demographic qualities of those primaries have to play. You know, like if Iowa weren't first, Iowa is, because it's a caucus rather than a primary, is disproportionately conservative. I mean, that's true in the Democratic primary. The reason every state had been a primary, Hillary Clinton would have won in 2008, despite her problems. She won because in the caucus states, Barack Obama appealed more to the wine set. The wine set was likelier to turn out in white caucus states. He won a lion's share of the delegates, and she won more delegates among the primaries, but he won more than enough among the caucus states to prevail. The Republican, it's the flip. You know, the more caucus state you get, the likelier you are to have libertarians and religious conservatives show up. So Iowa disproportionately helps religious conservatives. Iowa votes fourth. It's much less likely a religious conservative like Mike Huckabee gets the publicity that allows him to win the southern states a month later. So when I look at it through that prism, rather than the broad national electorate prism, I see Jeb, Christie's going to have enough money to be in Iowa. All of these candidates are going to have enough money to be in Iowa. And whoever wins Iowa gets so much national publicity that it's like they hit Super PAC gold mine.
Well, that's what happened to Santorum.
That's what happened to Santorum. That's what happened to
Even though
Huckabee.
Ron Paul in the end had the most delegates, right?
Well, that's because of
The caucus.
the caucus system. So, and then you get to the question of, given the antipathy among what you know is a fringe, but it's an empowered fringe in Iowa, and you have if he has a strong moderate or two strong moderates, could it be that Jeb Bush gets 18% in Iowa? And then the story is who won? It's not Jeb Bush, and where did the front runner finish? And it's not in the top three. Even if the margin is 22 to 18, and there's the press will give the $50 million bonus award to meeting or going under expectations, and that becomes a story. And then the next state is New Hampshire, which is 42 to 49% moderate to liberal in every Republican primary. There's virtually no movement conservative strength there. How does Jeb Bush recover if he's already been flanked to his left? And then it's two losses, and then you go. That's why I'm saying think about the race differently, and you could see where somebody who would be strong nationally might be, because of his peculiar weaknesses and the peculiar way the primary runs, weaker now than similarly situated people with different circumstances.
Doyle was next.
Thank you both. I'd like to ask both of you to expand, if you would, on how you might anticipate the debate over redefining Republican foreign policy to play out in the primaries among these candidates. You've touched on Rand Paul. The conventional wisdom, as you know, is that a couple of beheadings made non-interventionism less viable, less popular in the electorate as a whole, including the Republican electorate. I spent much of last week at CPAC, and it was striking, number one, how salient foreign policy was, and how there was only one non-interventionist on the premises. So there's an interventionist critique of Obama that is a very popular set of talking points. But Jeb Bush has spoken to these questions at some length, Marco Rubio obviously, the others less so. How would you see them differentiating themselves and carrying forward principles of foreign policy?
Shall I? Well, it's interesting. The Pauls always win CPAC. They have a family franchise. But it's true, Doral, how quickly all that changed. And Dimitri, who just left, was talking about that, how Rand apparently spoken in support of Netanyahu's speech. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or, what's interesting to me about it is, and here's about as broad brush as you can get, because this is something that's on my mind, so I'll just say it, and then Henry will actually give you concrete, useful information, is that each of the two parties in the modern era has undergone a huge transformation. You know, we think of them as being so static, especially in recent years, and so repetitive, almost a kind of Freudian repetition compulsion in what they say and what they do. We're seeing it now on Capitol Hill. And yet each of the parties redefined itself in a very striking, dramatic way. The Democratic Party, which had essentially been the party of the South, became the great civil rights party in America. First with Franklin Roosevelt, probably more with Eleanor, and then under Lyndon Johnson, it became the great party of civil rights, which no one would ever have predicted. And it's an extraordinary thing in our politics, and it was an extraordinary and great thing for our history, and yet now we all take it for granted. The other parallel, remarkable transformation was with the Republican Party and foreign policy. Is very much on my mind, because when we think of the transformation of the Republican Party that occurred in the 1960s, when the power shifted from the Herald Tribune and Thomas Dewey and Nelson Rockefeller to the Sun Belt, through that axis that Kevin Phillips was the great prophet of, and that Rick Perlstein and others have written about. What we forget was that a consensus formed at that same time within the party on foreign policy. So Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan were just as anti-communist as anybody coming out of the Northeast. And if you read Richard Norton Smith's biography of Nelson Rockefeller, you will be reminded how anti-communist he was. Yeah. And that was the glue that held it all together. That's why, to somebody like me who observes and tries to learn about it and then write something or other, this is a great moment for the Republican Party, because what's been assumed all along, this very strong interventionist, at times militant or militarily directed foreign policy, is now actually up for discussion. So Ambassador Burt, you have Henry Kissinger and others really interested in what Rand Paul has to say. The word isolationism is almost falling out of the vocabulary, right? It's almost gone now. And Taft himself used to say, and the Pauls are right when they say it too, don't say we're isolationists when we want economic engagement with every country on the planet. You know, what do we mean by isolation? It's an epithet. So now all of what's happened in the last few months, call it the ISIS moment, seems to have transformed that debate. For the moment, I still wouldn't bet on it for the reasons that Henry described. This is very much, I think Yuval Levin calls it the post-Cold War era. It's not even the memory of the Cold War. Cold War is a kind of historical artifact. So the views are going to be very different among millennial voters who are going to decide all of these things. It's a giant population, bigger than the baby boomers, however much you want to elasticize it, say it ended. The millennials are more numerous. Theirs is the generation that fought those wars, that went to Iraq and went to Afghanistan. And their view on all of this, I think, is still uncertain. ISIS, yes, it's terrifying, but maybe not on quite the scale, some would say. 6 months go by, 12 months go by, it looks a lot different. America looked a lot different 18 months after September 11th than it did right afterward. What I would hope is that Rand Paul could actually make a sustained argument for having a world in which a superpower acknowledges its strength through a kind of restraint, first of all. It'd be very interesting to see him take that to the public. When I interviewed him, I think it was in June, he said, imagine if it's me and Hillary. He said, guess who's the anti-war candidate? He said, you've taken our politics and turned it upside down. I think that would be just a useful thing for the country to see, to shake us out of our perceptions of what the parties are. But I don't know, if, especially as caucuses and primaries come up, whether even Rand Paul would take that risk. What do you think? Would he do it?
Yeah. Couple of things I just want to go through. I don't think he will. I'll briefly touch on the change of the parties, the debate I think will happen in the party and why, and the debate that should happen in the party and why. On the transformation of the parties, there's one fact that I like to use to talk about that, which is that as long as Mississippi and Vermont have both been in the Union, they have always voted against one another, with the exception of 3 races, 1972, 1980, and 1984, which is to say that as the coalition of the North being the more pro-government party and being localized in the Whigs or the Republicans switched to being the North being the Democratic Party and still being the more pro-government of the parties, versus the Democratic Party being the party of the Jacksonian Scots-Irish, to now where if you're Scots-Irish, you are almost certainly a Republican.
Unless you're Jim Webb, who might as well be a Republican.
Well, right.
Yeah.
Well, basically, Jim Webb is a viable candidate for the 1844 Democratic nomination.
That's right.
But as they switched, they kept their same role. Vermont voted for the more pro-interventionist candidate in the 1836 election, and the votes for the more governmental candidate in 2016. It's at the party switch. The debate that I think there is still a very strong latent consensus for a robust American presence overseas in the Republican Party. There are people within the Tea Party who equate all government spending as a problem, who dissent from that. There are the Libertarian Republicans who are becoming more numerous, who dissent with it on non-cost reasons. And then there's the need to appeal to the millennials in the general election, and the millennials have a very different view. But I think within the Republican Party, and this is why Rand is soft-pedaling his differences right now, there is that latent consensus that if there's something that, if evil arises in the world and it's obvious, we ought to combat it. Now, the debate I think should happen in the Republican Party is that we have never rethought our strategic framework since the fall of the Berlin Wall. What we effectively did was replace the Soviet Union with, originally, if we remember, the Weekly Standard was talking about the downing of the P-3 Orion. China before 9/11 was, shouldn't we mobilize against China? Now but it's the same question. We should have the same force structure. We should have the same international involvement, unconstrained by a superpower who can create unacceptable consequences. We should exert that power. That is a pre-9/11, pre-Cold War mindset. We need to have a different viewpoint. We need to have a debate that says, in a unipolar world, should there be something between isolationism and unrestrained interventionism? I think that's where the millennials actually are. I think that's where the center of the Republican Party is.
That's what Jacob's magazine is.
But it requires to actually say the words. That the reason we had 14 carriers and now we have 11 carriers is because we want to project American power anywhere and everywhere on a moment's notice. Everybody's problem is our own problem. In the Cold War, when you had a Soviet Union and an America and we were fighting proxy states, who controlled Zaire actually was an American interest. In fact, we used the French to control Zaire for us. Is it true in 2015 that who is in the power in Zaire matters to us? Should it matter? Why should it matter? That's the debate we should have. And I think I would disagree with Rand Paul, but I think were he to have that debate, it would be a good debate for us to have, but I do not think it's the one we'll have in this election.
Yeah, Ross Douthat says, and I have to be a fan, I don't know if anyone else in the room is, that the best primary for the Republican Party in ideological terms would be Rand Paul and Marco Rubio.
Yeah.
Then you really have the argument. What is stimulating to me, it's so interesting because here you have a Democratic primary that looks to be at the moment, and Jeff is right, you can always make a fool of yourself by predicting, in fact almost always will, but looks at the moment is being received as a walkover, that in the Republican Party you could actually have a serious debate about ideas and foreign policy. Seems like a tremendously stimulating thing, done by a new generation of political leaders, I think especially.
Christian Carl has been waiting in the back patiently. You might as well stand up, Christian.
Yeah, I should stand up. So a Republican friend of mine was saying the other day that he thought Jeb, I fully appreciate all the, the plus side of Jeb, but I heard of this very interesting argument the other day. And his argument was that Jeb is vulnerable on the same things that Hillary is vulnerable on. And he said corruption, dynasticism, and sense of entitlement. So if he becomes the candidate, he cannot attack her on those things. I wonder, have you heard this view? And also, do you think there's anything to that?
I've heard some, it's not usually expressed to me that directly, but it's implicitly expressed of, not another Bush versus Clinton. Certainly he has no ability to talk about political dynasties, except to say, would you rather have the Bush failings than the Clinton failings? I think that those are those can be weaknesses, but they will tend for Jeb, but they will tend to manifest themselves not in taking away those particular issues, but in the way he sees his path to victory, which is to say, if he sees in his heart, if he sees himself as being kind of the restoration, to use your word, of his father and his brother, in the sense that he's got a sense of entitlement, he sees no problem with the dynasty, what that means is he is stuck in the pre-9/11 world, which means is it won't be those issues that cost him, but because he has those viewpoints, that will mean that he will make mistakes that will cost him the opportunity to make the argument he actually needs to make. When I think about the Clinton and the Bush era, what I would think is that if Jeb Bush does what I expect him to do, which is advance a tax cut plan that will be basically supply side in its outlook, and to use language that talks about the need to free entrepreneurship. That seems to be in his bones. That if I were Hillary Clinton, I would just stand up and say, when your brother was in the White House, you cut taxes and wages went down. When my husband was in the White House, we raised taxes on the rich and wages went up. Which heritage do you want? He has no answer to that if he has not thought about how the world has changed since 1999. And if he has a sense of self-entitlement and dynasty, he will not think about that because the question will never occur to him.
Yeah, you know what could be one of the most effective speeches is the one Bill Clinton made in Denver in 2008. Who brought the jobs? Who brought the jobs? Add up, right? And he said it again in 2012. That could be very effective.
Look, for most Americans, inflation-adjusted median income peaked in 1999. It didn't go higher than 1999 even during the Bush recovery. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that, and trying to get at the heart of that should be the heart of a Republican economic message. And if it's not, it leaves whoever the Republican candidate is very vulnerable, particularly if the candidate is a Hillary Clinton who's not incompetent. And I might want to say, talking about predictions, at this point in 1987, everyone thought that George Herbert Walker Bush was too ham-handed to actually win a general election because he was clearly an incompetent candidate who couldn't connect with ordinary people.
I'm still surprised he won.
Yeah. Well, actually, I read the Drummond and Whitcover book after that election, and they had the Gallup polls in the background. His ratings never changed. What happened was Dukakis went from being unknown to known to being upside down. Even worse. So it was really was a I don't want this guy, but this guy's a complete turkey.
We're going to collect the last two questions from Dan McCarthy and Stan Vieger, and then we'll release everyone from this.
Thank you, Jacob. I would kind of like to ask both panelists what their thoughts about Jeb Bush's Catholicism, how that's going to affect not only the Republican primaries in the general election, but also what kinds of policy manifestations it might have, whether Jeb, for example, might have a different approach to the way he makes policies, especially foreign policy, than his brother or his father, given their different religious backgrounds.
Stan, why don't you fire away now?
So I'm Bush. I feel like you're starting to sound more optimistic than you did initially about his chances.
Are you talking to me or to
I'm
Sam?
talking to Henry.
Okay.
I get the sense his name recognition is 100%. He's polling at 15%. That 15% is the 15% that wants to cut taxes. If he gets rid of that part of the Republican platform too, then he's basically a Democrat. And the second point I'd like to make is normally the establishment candidate runs on electability. Bush will have to make that case as follows. Look, I can win the general election because my brother took the country to Iraq and to a global financial crisis. That strikes me as a hard argument to make. I don't know how you feel about that. That's the millennial view, one could say.
Dan, that great part, very quickly, and just out of curiosity, do we know how devout Jeb Bush is? We don't know. And is that partly through his marriage that he... yeah, okay.
He converted because Columba was Catholic. He was raised
Right,
Protestant.
that's what I thought, yeah. It's an interesting idea. Is JFK still our last Catholic president? Is he the only one?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say first with your question. The social right in the Republican Party is not Catholic. They reluctantly backed Rick Santorum when there were no viable non-Catholic alternatives. And I think it's a great credit to our country that denominational differences that were once polarizing are no longer polarizing. That said, the wing of the Republican Party that is motivated by religion does not wants to support a Protestant. So
it does want to support a Protestant.
Yes, it wants to support a Protestant. It prefers to support a non-denominational Protestant or a Southern Baptist Protestant because, frankly, the vast majority of the people who are primarily motivated by that are Southern Baptist. Although, if you're exclusively that way, the way Mike Huckabee was, Rick Santorum ran much better among socially conservative Catholics and non-Baptists in 2012 than Huckabee did in 2008, who witnessed the Dutch Reformed in Grand Rapids, who are extremely socially conservative, but they didn't cotton to Mike Huckabee. So it won't be a problem, but it will be a barrier in the sense that there is a segment of the Republican Party that wants to elect a Protestant social issue focused person, and those people will not look first at Jeb Bush. And as long as there's somebody who cottons, who they like, they will then not switch to Jeb Bush in subsequent races. So in the general election, I think it will matter nothing. I don't think denomination matters one way or another. I think Republicans have tended to have problems with because so few Republican in leadership are actually Catholic, even in this day and age. In the establishment classes, they tend, like the Mitt Romney campaign, not to understand the Catholic vote and understand how ethnic it is and how different it is and how different lapsed Catholics are from church-going Catholics and so forth. I doubt Jeb Bush will make the same mistake. So in that sense, he won't have, because he's been more in touch with that side, he won't have the same general election errors, but I don't think it'll be a big help for him. But it will be a bit of a barrier, not because of anti-Catholicism, but because of non-Protestantism, with 10 to 20% of the Republican electorate nationally, and in some states 30 to 40%. About your question, Stan, Jeb Bush's electability is not going to be defeat and depression round two. the way you kind of painted it out to be. You know, Jeb Bush's electability argument, as he is putting it out, is I'm the person who's not the Tea Party crazy, hence why he's not going to sign the pledge, who cares about the right to rise. And that means everybody. That means Indian Americans, and that means Hispanics, and that means African Americans. So the question for Jeb Bush's electability is, one, will Republican voters buy that? And I think the hardcore conservative will not. I think the establishment conservative will. And then the question is, does somebody emerge to his left to preclude him from gaining moderate votes once it winnows out of an early race? I do not think that's the right strategy for the general election. But I do think it's the argument that he will make, and I think he could very well get through a primary with that. But he's still very, he's, because he has been so absent from the public stage for 15 years, he does have the opportunity to remake himself. And if he thinks of himself in a way that understands that, we could very well be seeing a very different Jeb Bush in the last half of the year than I'm reading from the little tea leaves I can get right now. But if he basically does see himself as the continuation of the third dynasty, and he doesn't see that the country, it's not just that there are more Hispanics, but the country has fundamentally changed since 9/11 in a way that incorporates but does not replicate prior political disputes, then he'll make the mistakes that I mentioned, and we'll see a lot more difficulty.
Jeff, Cabinet Service, as a Floridian, do you think Rubio would run if Jeb does?
Yeah. There just isn't room for Rubio. I mean, I think Rubio is going to be the ideal vice president.
Which I might want to say, which is why I think he's focusing on foreign policy right now, because given that almost everybody is weak on foreign policy, and he can be the person who knows more about a subject that everyone's going to be weak on, it provides a substantive value add. Oh, he couldn't beat Jeb's. Right, but everybody else who could be is...
Well, I'd like to thank both Henry and Sam both for making the trip down from New York and for writing the article in the first place. It's not always that easy to extract these long essays. And Sam came through brilliantly, I think, so I'm very grateful. And I was also going to admonish anyone who's in this room and still does owe me an essay, which some people do, to furnish them quickly. Thanks.